Yep. Okay. Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this joint GCRF-AFRICAP and Global Food and Environment Institute seminar. I'll say a little bit about each of those two things in a minute, over a couple of slides. But welcome to everyone who's here in the room. We've got a very full room here at Leeds, and welcome to the many of you who are joining online. And please, everyone, be thinking about questions that you will have for the end. We want to have a good discussion at the end and bring people both near and far into that. So GCRF-AFRICAP is a very large program focusing on climate smart food systems in Africa, in 4 countries: Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, and South Africa. And this diagram will sort of sets out the structure of the project. So around the edges, which actually means throughout the whole project, we have a strong capacity building training, a knowledge sharing element across the UK and sub-Saharan Africa. So that kind of works kind of in many ways and on many levels. And we have, and you can see at the top, with partners Fanapan and Chatham House, a large component on informing policy, which involves workshops and engaging with national policy. And then in the blue box at the bottom, you can see scenario development, participatory evaluation of agricultural strategies. So we've got field work, we've got policy, and then in the middle, the red box, which I really like, just because I'm biased, we have integrated modelling tools, so backcasting, scaling up, and evaluating pathways. So this, in many ways, is the kind of, and this is unbiased view. I see this as the glue of the project, where we can interact with the policy elements right down to the fieldwork elements and provide and support these integrated scenarios. So it's a really exciting project, and so that's all I want to say about AFRICAP. And the Global Food and Environment Institute is an interdisciplinary research institute here at Leeds, which is really looking at global food systems. And it's really exciting to pull from right across campus. You know, the meetings we've had have been really exciting in terms of bringing the different people in different disciplines to have conversations. So there are 4 linked research priorities: food and livelihoods in the global south, which obviously relates to AFRICAP, to GCRF-AFRICAP, urban food consumption and health, environment, crops and agri-food, and international food supply networks. So these are the things that we need to look at to really think about socially just, climate smart, sustainable food systems that are really about vigorously enhancing the future habitability of Earth. So it's really it's a big grand vision type project. So you can join up. That's the good news, and help us tackle 21st century global challenge of feeding the world and protecting environmental resources. And there's an email address there, which I've hopefully given you enough time to take note of and scribble down in order to be in touch. So without further ado, I will introduce today's speaker, Professor Pete Smith from Aberdeen, who is taking part in the AFRICAP project and is helping with leading the work on agricultural emissions. So it's part of that kind of modelling strand of work. And Peter served various roles on the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, in DFID's advisory group, and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology, the Institute of Soil Sciences. Actually, we take up all the time that we have in the seminar if I were to list the whole thing. But Pete's an extremely able scientist in that area of mitigation, and an extremely important part of Africa. So without further ado, Pete, please come take the floor.
Thank you, Andy. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about what I was asked to talk about today is the special report on climate change and land, the IPCC report that was released at the end of last year. And I'm going to talk about that as we go through the slides. I'll talk about how that is important for Africa. So the bits that are particularly important for Africa, I'll try and pull those out as we go through. So if I can get this working. I can. Good. Okay. So the special report, this is the short name, the special report on climate change and land. It also includes land degradation, desertification, food security, sustainable land management. The title hardly fits on one slide, but this is the short title, and I'll just tell you a little bit about that project. So it's a special report. The IPCC does assessment reports, which are those really big fat things you get every 5 or 6 years, which cover things like the physical science basis of the climate, the impact and adaptation side, and the mitigation side. But within that cycle of every 5 or 6 years, there are special reports which are put together where the governments have asked the IPCC, we want a particular report on A, B, or C. The 3 reports that are occurring and that have already now been delivered during this 6th assessment cycle of the IPCC are the report on oceans and cryosphere and climate change. Not going to talk about that today. The very influential report on 1.5, hitting the 1.5 degree target that came out of the Paris Agreement, what the implications are for that. That was a really influential report which has led us to have net zero targets now via the Committee on Climate Change. And this report, the one I'm talking about today, the Special Report on Climate Change and Land, which arose from a whole bunch of countries saying we want a report on climate change and desertification, another country saying we want one on degradation, another 2 saying we want one on sustainable land management, others saying that they want something specifically on food security. And in the end, these were all thrown together into a big report that tries to cover all of those issues that are related to climate change and how it interfaces with the land. So on this particular report, there were 107 authors. 40% of the convening lead authors are female. They come from 52 countries. Very importantly for this report, because a lot of the issues associated with land use and climate change impact most in developing countries. So over half of the authors on this report are from developing countries. We assessed 7,000 scientific publications. It is as horrible as it sounds. And we received nearly just over 28,000 review comments during the course of putting this together. You know, when you get a paper back and you get a couple of author responses and you say, oh no, we've got to answer those. If you're really unlucky, you get 3. This is how many we had to respond to. Each one of these individual comments has to have an individual response. So you spend a lot of your time working this through, but it does make the process very transparent and very open, if a little horrible for the people doing it.
Right. You're right if we interrupt.
Please, yeah.
So was it a publicly available document?
Yes.
It was for open consultation. Is that why it generated?
It is. So what happens is the first round it goes out to experts. The second 2 times it goes out to governments, and the governments send it out to their experts. So you get a big Excel sheet with anything from some really fundamental things, challenging fundamental things in the science, to other comments saying you missed a full stop here or there shouldn't be a comma there. Each one of those, even the annoying ones, has to have an individual response. So this is over the course of an expert review and 2 government and expert reviews, and those are the sorts of comments that come in and need to be dealt with. All of this is a matter of public record, and you can log on to the website and you can access all of these comments so that you can see how the different drafts of the chapters evolve. The other thing that was important for this is that the IPBES were doing their assessment on land degradation, and the wider reports, the regional reports, at around about the same time. So it was important not to cover the same ground. So in terms of the biodiversity and ecosystem services, we engaged with IPBES authors and we had some overlap between them. We also, because of the emphasis on degradation and desertification, we were also, although this is driven by the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there's also the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, obviously very relevant to this one. So they were involved in helping to shape this also. And then we had a bunch of FAO employees, because FAO is the United Nations organization which is implementing agriculture and food issues, particularly in developing countries. So this is the full title. As I said, it's a monster. It came together as a result of all these different proposals from different governments, all thrown into the melting pot, and we end up with this great big long title, which not many people can remember, and it looks like this. So some of the key issues. So there's not going to be many. There aren't going to be many primary results in this. This is a synthesis report which pulls together lots of primary information and tries to synthesize that. So we're not going to have any graphs today saying In experiment 1, we found this. In experiment 2, we found that. It's not going to be that kind of talk. It's going to be the high-level messages. So the first thing is that land is undergoing human pressure. So we know that a large proportion of the land is degraded, and that degradation is getting worse. We also have intense hotspots of desertification occurring, where that degradation is happening in arid and semi-arid areas. And we know that it's undergoing human pressure because the population's growing and demands for different dietary components are changing, particularly the growth in demand for meat and dairy, which is putting growing pressure on that human land. Those are the threats. In terms of the sort of the upside of this is that land can be part of the solution. So land, through better management, can be part of the solution, both to try to halt and then to reverse land degradation, to halt desertification, but it's also part of the solution to help communities to adapt to climate change, and is also part of the solution largely through carbon sequestration and improved management practices to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that agriculture emits. Agriculture emits something like 24% of all greenhouse gases that are due to human activity. So it's a real significant part of the problem. So those can be reduced, but we can also use the land for creating carbon sinks to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We'll come back onto that one a bit later. But having gone from that sort of pressures, the up message, the down message is that land can't do it all. Now, the people of us working in this field, we already know that we can't use the land to sequester all of the carbon that is currently being emitted through fossil fuels. We've known that for a while, but some policymakers are running away with the idea that it's much easier to plant a few trees. You will see that in the last election, all the parties were outbidding each other on how many trees they were going to plant as an easy win, which is popular and doesn't ask people to get out of their cars. So there are some of these sort of options where the land is regarded as something that we can use. Some people regard it as an infinite resource that we can use. But one of the key things to come out of this is that land can't do it all. So land can have some significant impact in terms of helping to combat desertification, land degradation, to help provide food security, to provide mitigation and adaptation options, but it can't do it all. We need aggressive and immediate reduction in greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors of the economy. What we do on the land is the icing on the cake. It is not the cake itself. So the other thing to note is that the land that we're already using could feed the world in a changing climate and provide biomass for renewable energy, but it requires early, far-reaching action across several fronts. So the fact that we have over 800 million people going to bed hungry and undernourished every night is not because we can't grow enough food on the land that we've already got available. It's due to economic access. It's due to the fact that people don't have access to the food, they can't afford the food's not in the right place. So these are other things to do with the food chain that aren't to do with that production side of it. We spend a lot of money on research into how we can improve production, but that's just a tiny part of the problem. We of course need to do that, but that's a tiny part of the whole food security problem. How we can use the land better is by improving the productivity of that land, but without increasing the inputs, which would give us negative environmental impacts. And also some of the issues that I'll come back onto in a moment is to do with dietary change. And I'm sure if Tim was here, Tim Benton, he would bang on for the whole half an hour about it. I promise not to do that, but I will mention it because it's relevant. So we need coordinated action to tackle climate change. That could simultaneously improve land, food security and nutrition. I'll come on to the evidence base for that in a moment, and it could help to end hunger. So what we've found from this, surprisingly, is that there are a whole bunch of win-win options, or win-win-win options, if you like, which can improve the land in terms of its sustainable land management, can produce more food, as well as providing nutritious food, and can help to end hunger. We'll come on to those in a minute. Better land management can play its part in tackling climate change, but as I've mentioned already, it can't do it all. So we can't just sit back, continue emitting greenhouse gases, particularly from fossil fuels, as we currently do, and expect the land to pick up the bill. We need to address that issue first and foremost, and then we can use the land to be part of that solution. So there were separate chapters after a sort of a framing chapter. There was a chapter on sort of the climate change, the greenhouse gas exchanges with the land, a chapter on land degradation, a chapter on desertification, a chapter on food security, and a chapter which I led, which was looking at pulling all those things together. But let's just go through some of the highlights, particularly with respect to food and agriculture, because that's most important, I think, to the audience that we have here today. So firstly, we've got this over 800 million people who are undernourished. And at the same time as having undernourished people, we've also got a significant overnourishment problem, if you like, with 2 billion adults overweight and obese, with that number increasing. And this is not just in developed countries, this is also in developing countries. So within countries, we have undernourished and overnourished obese people, and sometimes even within the same families, in the same households, we have this issue. So the food system is already under pressure from a whole bunch of stressors. So population and income growth, income for these animal source products, the livestock products, particularly meat and dairy, but also under pressure from climate change. So Andy here and Stuart and others are doing work looking at how climate change will impact our ability to grow food in the future, what impact that will have on yields. That's really important. But piling in on top of those climate change are these other stresses to do with the way that we use the land, all driven by this increase in population growth and changing demand for food. So climate change is already affecting food security through increasing temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and particularly the frequency of extreme events, so floods, droughts, extreme heat waves, those sorts of things. There's an excellent evidence base for this already. So we're not now looking at climate change as something that might happen in the future. We're looking at something that's happening now. And outside the, we're looking outside agriculture. You've seen the wildfires that have been happening in Australia, in New South Wales, and South Australia in particular, Victoria, that are, an example of this sort of extreme event, which is happening linked to climate change. And even the American PM, who's been a climate denier for the last few years, has now at least acknowledged the link between these extreme events and climate change. So we also know that distributions of pests and diseases will change. So that will affect production negatively in many regions. In the north, where we have milder winters, some of the pests that used to get killed during the winter are now surviving longer. In other parts of the world, where we're seeing changes in the distribution of pests and diseases, that could also continue, and it could be more unpredictable, which will lead to more loss in the field. About 30% of all the food grown in developing countries is wasted, largely before it even gets to market, through poor storage and through loss in the field, through pests and through storage. So there's a significant issue already with food waste in the system, and that is projected to get worse as a result of climate change. And food security and climate change have strong gender dimensions. So for the people who are working on, particularly in the social science field, on looking at how gender plays a role in this, in some countries, the men own the land, but the women work the land. So there's an issue there associated with some of the gender politics associated with that. The women not feeling empowered, not being empowered to use sustainable land management because they have a limited interest in the land, even though they're doing a lot of work. And many practices that can be optimized and scaled up, they advance mitigation throughout the food, adaptation throughout the food system. So we've got this interplay between climate change putting pressure on the food system, adaptation being improved by sustainable land management practices. They're not all sustainable land management practices. There are some in the food system and some that are outside the food system, but I'll come on to that in a moment. So as I mentioned, the agriculture is responsible for about 24% of greenhouse gas emissions. If we just look at agriculture as direct emissions, if we include in all the transport emissions, and we include the storage, refrigeration, all those sorts of things, then the food system itself is responsible for 25 to 30% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's one that rarely gets much media coverage. When we're talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you see a lot of the stuff on the TV. It's about changing the way that we produce and use energy. But it's really important to know that somewhere up to a third of our greenhouse gas emissions on the planet is caused by the fact that we need to eat and our food system. So there are supply side practices that can help mitigation, and these are largely based on crop and livestock emissions. So those are things like, we know that rice is produces a lot of methane, so that's a significant source in the agricultural system. So better management of rice through things like mid-season drainage helps to reduce emissions. Another big source of emissions is nitrous oxide from over-fertilization. So this is particularly prevalent in China and in India, where fertilizers are subsidized. There are large nitrous oxide emissions there, which could be reduced. And then there's livestock emissions. We know that a large proportion of the livestock itself is responsible for about 14.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions that we as humans produce. And of that 14.5%, about half of that is attributable to ruminants. So that's largely cattle and sheep and goats and things like that. So improving the way that we manage livestock, or changing demand for livestock products by changing diet so that we don't overconsume, is another way to take some of that pressure off the land. The other thing that we can do in the land sector, I'm going to try using that and hope it doesn't blow up. It did blow up. It blew up even worse. Is this absorbing carbon? So we can, if we manage the soils better, we can get more of the photosynthetically captured carbon into the soil, where it can form a medium-term pool of carbon for carbon sequestration. We've also got similar vegetation carbon sinks by planting trees, the one that I mentioned earlier, the one that's really popular in the last election campaign. We plant trees, we capture the carbon into the biomass, and while that carbon is stored in the biomass, it's not then in the atmosphere. And the other thing that we can do is we can decrease the emissions intensity within sustainable production systems. So what that means is that's reducing the greenhouse gas emissions per unit of product. So every time we improve the efficiency of a system, we can decrease the amount of emissions we have per unit of product that we get at the end. So if we're getting 1 tonne per hectare per year of a given crop in some African country, if for the same amount of input through better management or through better germplasm or whatever, we could increase that to 4 tonnes per hectare for the same amount of emissions, then the emissions intensity has come down by a factor of 4. So this form of sustainable intensification can help reduce the emissions intensity so that we can produce the same amount of food with less emissions. Consumption of balanced diets presents a major opportunity for reducing emissions. So many countries, so the developed countries and a whole bunch of economies in transition, currently overconsume livestock products significantly. We consume more protein. We need about 60 grams of protein a day, and we currently consume nearly twice that. So we could reduce the amount of livestock protein in the diet without having to go down the route of insect protein and all this sort of stuff, all these red herrings that are currently thrown up. If we're not eating meat, what else are we going to eat? The answer is that we don't need to eat that much anyway. We're actually wasting a lot of that. It's going through our digestive system and is being wasted. So in over-consuming countries, reducing the amount of livestock products that we consume can have a significant impact on reducing emissions and improving the non-communicable disease health outcomes. And for the countries that are under-consuming, then they would be able to consume a bit more of the livestock products and able to get them to their nutrition security. So in the same way as being proposed for other fossil fuel sectors, other emission sectors, particularly fossil fuels, we could have this contract and converge model where the countries that are currently emitting way more than their fair share come down towards the global average, and the countries that are underproducing, particularly the least developed countries, can increase their consumption so that we come up to a global average where we have a healthy, balanced diet. A lot of good work was done on this in the Eat Lancet Commission. I've mentioned already a bit on food loss and waste. That could lower emissions significantly. So 30% of all the food, not just in developed countries, but also developed countries and developing countries, we waste about 30% of all the food we grow. As I mentioned earlier, in developing countries, that's largely to do with, before it gets to the market, in developed countries, that's stuff that we throw away because the apple has a blemish, or the banana is the wrong shape, it's in some other way ugly, or we get a buy one, get one free offer. So we take 2 lots of bananas home with us because it's free, and we waste 1 set of bananas, and they get thrown away. We're not clever enough to cook them up with a bit of chocolate in the middle and eat them for dessert. So this sort of stuff, you know, does happen. 30% of all that food is wasted. That's 30% of land that we're using on the planet to grow food that we're not eating. That's crazy. So that needs to be reduced. And then policies, market, institutions and governance are needed to enable this change. So this can't be made just by individuals. It can't just be made by farmers. In many countries where some of the barriers are to do with markets, institutions, and particularly poor governance, then those need to be improved. Those are the enabling conditions under which these improvements can be made. Okay, let's come on to a little bit more of the nitty-gritty. So these are the response options that were considered. In fact, we considered 40 response options. These are the ones that we've got global data for across all of those different categories: adaptation, mitigation, desertification, land degradation, and food security. Out of those 40, these are the ones that we're left with where we've got global data. So what we can see here is that we've got response options based on land management. These are the sustainable land management options. Many in agriculture, some in forests, some that are particularly to do with the soils, and that can be either in forestry or agriculture, and some that cut across ecosystems or in other ecosystems that we're not using for food production. So a large number of sustainable land management options. But those aren't the only ones. We've also got these value chain options, some of which I've mentioned already. So the reduction of waste, either post-harvest or in the consumer and retailer, sustainable sourcing, improved energy use, dietary change. These aren't land management options, but they're important issues in the global food system that we can improve. And then we've got a few others that sit outside this. In fact, there were 6 of these, but only 3 have global data. And these are things like livelihood diversification, management or prevention of urban sprawl, and risk sharing instruments. That's things like crop insurance, which can have positive or negative impacts. So for all of these ones, we were able to find studies which gave us an estimate of the global impact. So we tried to put that together using information from the literature and also information that was coming out of the other chapters to see how it all works out. Now this is horrible. I'm going to show you in a moment. We're going to zoom in. So the only thing I want you to see from this is that these are quantitative estimates of mitigation, adaptation, desertification, land degradation, and food security for all of those options that I've just discussed. They're quantitative in that mitigation gives you a large, small, or moderate potential in gigatons of CO2 equivalents. The adaptation is how many millions of people have their situation improved by each of these practices. Desertification and land degradation, how many millions of square kilometers are improved by these practices. And in food security, how many million people, large, moderate or small, either positive or negative, have their situation improved. The main thing to notice on that, don't try and read the detail, but when we set about doing this, I was expecting that we were going to have a picture like this, which would be sort of roughly half red and roughly half blue, that we would find just as many trade-offs as we would find co-benefits. Anything that's in blue on this side is showing a co-benefit, and the darker the blue, then the greater the co-benefit, the larger the positive impact. And what we can see there, if we just take a couple, well, we'll go into it in a bit more detail in a moment, but you can see some that are blue across the board, and you can see one or two where we've just got the odd red one, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a moment. 6 of those have been taken out, largely because they have potentially a large negative impact on food security. So they receive special treatment, largely from the countries, the people who are objecting to just putting it all in one table, which largely countries that have a big interest in bioenergy. I won't mention any names, but it could be somewhere like Brazil. Forestation and reforestation, again, and afforestation, countries that have large forest areas for protection and for afforestation and reforestation. And then this biochar addition to the soil. So let's just have a look in a little bit more detail. The main takeaway message is there's a whole bunch of things that we can do that have positive impacts across all of these things. And we're not maximizing the potential for those practices to help. So this is just zooming in on that one. What we can see here is that we've got things like sustainable intensification by increasing food productivity helps with mitigation. So the intensification of food production in the past, although it's not been done sustainably, has maybe saved about 13 gigatons of CO2 equivalents every year since we started doing it, because we're producing more with less input. It also helps with adaptation. It also helps with desertification and land degradation, because it puts less pressure on the land. And of course, if we're producing more, then it also helps with food security. Agroforestry is another one with all dark blue all the way across. And you can see many of these, even where they've got a lower blue in terms of their positive impact. Things like improved cropland management, livestock management, agriculture diversification, improved grazing land management. These don't have any negative impacts. So if we can improve those things, it's going to help us to address climate change, land degradation, desertification, and help to underpin food security. So there are these sustainable land management options in agriculture, forestry, soils, and across other ecosystems. We've got these value chain ones with reducing losses and dietary change, also showing all positive benefits. So the slides, I think, are going to be available, so you don't need to see this. It's all in the main report anyway, but we'll make these slides available. There's also one on cost. We won't go into that at the moment. So then what we also did was pull out these ones that are contentious. We pulled those out because if we use large-scale bioenergy, if we do it in a way that is going to deliver maybe sort of more than 3 gigatons of CO2, so up to maybe over 10 gigatons of CO2 per year, we need huge areas of biomass plantations to do that. We can't do that all with forest thinnings and compost and bits of straw and such like. We'd actually need dedicated plantations for that. That could have a negative impact on food security. If we need to take out an area of land greater than the size of India to grow biomass, to burn, to generate negative emissions with bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, that potentially has a big impact on food security. It could also impact upon land degradation and desertification, and it could also be bad for adaptation. Great for mitigation, we're removing a lot of CO2, but there are some trade-offs. So this is what happens if we do it globally. But there are situations where if you put, depends on the scale of it. So if you're doing, it's the same with afforestation. If we take out the size of India by planting trees, then we're going to have a bad impact on food security. If around Leeds, the city council plants up a few trees in the parks, it's not going to have any impact. So it's to do with the way that it's integrated within a sustainable land management system. And qualitatively, this is quantitative, but qualitatively, you could see that there could be positive impacts on these if it's done properly. So if you put bioenergy into sustainably managed agricultural landscapes, there could be ways of doing this which don't impact badly on degradation and desertification. In fact, if you're replacing some of the area that's been overgrazed, or you're replacing something that's been overexploited in the cropland, then maybe putting in perennial crops would actually do some good. Okay, so the main thing, and it came as a surprise to me and didn't realise it was going to happen until we did the analysis, is all these co-benefits. A whole bunch of things that we can do. If we do them properly, there's a bad way of doing everything, and we humans have a way of finding that bad way of doing it and implementing it that way. But if we can find the right way of doing it, we can have a big impact. There are interlinkages. So some have carbon dioxide, some have co-benefits, and they're effective when paired. So for example, we spoke a bit about reducing waste, where 30% of our land is used to grow food that we never consume. We spoke a bit about dietary change, which could significantly reduce the amount of land, water, greenhouse gas emissions that we need to feed everyone. A ruminant meat, for example, has a greenhouse gas footprint, a climate footprint, 10 to 100 times greater than the equivalent quantity of plant-based foods. So we're talking orders of magnitude difference in the impacts on land and greenhouse gases. So this can free up land, and if we free up that land, we could then feed everybody sustainably on a smaller area with smaller emissions, and we could then maybe use some of that land that we free up to plant trees or to use it for bioenergy. So there are these interlinkages between the different options where some make things more effective. So some practices in the value chain are enabling for some of the options that we want to do across the other parts of the value chain. Others conflict, and that example that I just showed with bioenergy is one that can potentially conflict. Some responses are feasible. We know how to do them. We've been doing them for thousands of years, and maybe it's just the pressure that's causing us to now do our farming and doing our land management badly. Some are less feasible than others. We've got some options in there that we looked at, for example, the application of crushed minerals for enhanced weathering. Potentially a great technology, but we don't know anything about it yet, and it's not being done at scale. Changing the tillage practice and residue management in the soil, we've been doing for thousands of years. Some of these other ones we've not been doing so well. We need coordinated action. That's obvious. The other thing is getting this point across about the urgency. So delayed action has a number of consequences. Firstly, we're in a world with more climate change. So things like creating carbon sinks in forestry become less effective because they're much more prone to reversal by wildfire. Things like increasing temperatures could increase the rate of decomposition in the soil organic matter. So doing less now means that they can be less effective and more costly in the future. So if we do them now, some of them are cost neutral, some of them are cost negative, some of them cost a bit of money, but they become more costly and more risky the longer we leave it and the longer we fail to make action. So early action has challenges due to technology upscaling and barriers. If it was so great, we'd be doing it already. So there are some barriers in the way, institutional, educational, governance, all that. Some responses don't address the underlying drivers. So for example, you can do great management around your city, but urban expansion is not. Urban expansion is happening because of population growth and through rural depopulation. Those are the underlying drivers. We can manage some of them, but we may not tackle them.
Just before you go on, go back to that one just for a second.
Yeah.
The second bottom point.
Yep.
Would you read that one again?
Early action has challenges related to technology, upscaling, and barriers.
I think that might be its own chapter.
It could have been, couldn't it?
Everything that you've said, we've known for maybe 10 years.
Yeah.
But that one has gotten in the way of all of those
Yeah.
good ideas. I mean,
Yeah.
most of the cost neutral positive things
Yeah.
we've done a long time ago.
That's right.
But
Yeah.
clearly
We've got an even more horrible table than the one I showed you already on barriers. Yeah, so there are some barriers there, and then chapter 7, which followed this one, is about the policy response options, which deals with that. So if that's your bag, the end of chapter 6 and chapter 7 is the bit to focus on, and that, it comes up, it frames the problems well, but I think the solutions are less clear there. So in terms of the big picture, in terms of policy, agricultural emissions have largely been left out of climate policy. So the negotiations have only started recently to include agriculture. That's crazy and we can only move forward really if we include agricultural emissions in mainstream climate policy. That needs to start happening. Acting earlier averts some of those risks, reduces losses, and can generate better returns on investment. So there's a compelling case to start action now. We need to measure progress towards goals, so monitoring, reporting, and verification for all of these things is important. Also, it will enable decision making, adaptive governance, and policy success. Flexible, adaptive, iterative approach is needed because the land is complicated. That's why it took a special report to deal with it, and it couldn't all just be done in one paper to Nature or Science or whatever. So these things are difficult. They're very context specific. So an issue will work in one place but not another, even within the same country, even maybe on different sides of Leeds. What about Africa? So I've tried to talk about things that would be particularly important to Africa, particularly the land degradation issues and the overpopulation driving some of the desertification issues. So these are all really serious. So land degradation and desertification, I think, were pushed by governments in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa as important issues because they affect our ability to respond to some of these challenges. We've got degraded ecosystems, poor land management, then that's going to be difficult. We already know that there are food and nutrition security challenges in many African countries, and those are already severe. So it's not like we're looking at a perfect situation now and wondering what we're going to do in the future. We're inherited a broken system which isn't working well, and we're looking for ways to improve that in the face of climate change. The impact of climate change on production in Africa is projected to be severe, both through slow changes, Andy Stewart's work contributing to that, lots of others also showing that these issues are going to be important, but also extreme events, so losing crops entirely to drought and to floods and such like. And those are projected to increase. Those are already severe. Population increase is projected to be very fast in Africa. So Africa as a continent has a very young population. A population is growing very rapidly. People are still having quite a lot of kids. And the population could be 2.4 billion people by 2050. That's a significant pressure, exacerbating all of these other problems on land degradation and the requirement for food. I think the barriers to implementation, coming back to the excellent question that was raised earlier, these economic, biophysical, institutional, educational, social barriers are more difficult. The governance barriers are more difficult in many parts of Africa compared to other ones. And AFRICAP, I think, can do, we're not going to solve all of these problems with AFRICAP. I'd love to be able to say that at the end of AFRICAP, Africa's sorted. It's not going to be, but it can play a role, I think, in charting that way through, I think, what are going to be very stormy waters ahead. So a continent which already has limited capacity to deal with the issues, already has significant issues with land degradation, desertification, food security, and with climate change projected to be laid on top of that, then I think that this is if we can solve these issues in Africa, we can do them anywhere. So it's going to be an enormous challenge, but one that I hope we can begin to address. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Pete, for that really wide-ranging and informative talk. Are there questions? I'm sure there are questions. Comments for Pete following that.
Bring it on.
Bring it on. So I have one. I mean, to what extent? So this is a really complex problem with a whole range of actors, from individuals, consumers, business, governments, all of whom need to take action. You talked about the need for coordination. To what extent are there simple and clear messages that are, given all of those blue buttons on that table, that it seems that there ought to be simple, clear messages.
Yeah.
One that gets talked about is plant-based eating, but then you hear other sides of the argument. They say, well, actually, that's not going to solve it because transport or various different sort of counter arguments. Are there any simple, clear messages that are actually, yes, you can take this one away and run with it? Is that one of them? Are there others?
I think so. So I think improving soil management, obvious. I would say that because I'm a soil scientist, but that helps. That underpins all of these other things. So it underpins your production. It helps to prevent desertification. It's one of the key components of land degradation. So better soil management is something that's relatively easy to do. It's something we know how to do. So I think that would be the thing that we could do better. So that would be one. Agroforestry is another one, where there are significant inroads, not just in Africa but elsewhere, where that's been shown to work pretty well to improve production rather than to decrease production. Also to create carbon sinks, areas for natural pests, natural predators for pests and such like.
Yeah.
So there are some no-brainers there. Having said that, the fact that they're not happening already shows that there are these barriers. These barriers are the things that stop it. What's fascinating about working in this space is that I know a little bit of the puzzle. You know a little bit of the puzzle. Everybody in this room knows a little bit of the puzzle, but none of us have got the overview. That's why multidisciplinary centres like the Global Food and Environment Institute is going to be so important in tackling those issues within Leeds. But I think we need some of those things, across countries and across regions to be able to do that. Because, the people who know nothing about governance, I know how to say it, I'm not even quite sure what it means. But I'm not going to have anything useful to say about governance, whereas there are other people in the room who maybe wouldn't have anything to say about soils or crop production and such like.
I'm glad I'm not the only one who knows the governance is important but isn't quite sure. Andy?
Yeah, I'm interested, Pete, just sort of 5 months on from its publication, if you've got any sense of one of the authors or you hear any feedback as to it having an impact. I mean, for AFRICAP, I lead the Malawi work and some of the sort of stuff there, but when I'm talking to the policymakers there in terms of a national development plan, it's still, let's move from smallholders to big plantations, let's think out of the box, but it's not really thinking of how do we store more carbon in the landscape. So, do you get any sense, or is it a case you publish this and then you leave it to us?
Well, hopefully it's not as bad as the latter case. I mean, there are things that have started up. So there's a carbon sequestration initiative that's been started up with FAO. It wasn't started up as a result of this. It was something that was happening already. So those sorts of things where the resources are now being put within FAO into helping these sorts of things happen in developing countries, including in Africa, will help. So I think it's going to be a slow burn. It's not something that landed on the policymakers' desks and they said, sorted, all we need to do is do these things. It's not like that. But it is getting included into things like the revised nationally determined contributions for the Paris Agreement, where some of the developing countries have realised that they've missed a trick by not including, for example, agroforestry. So they've got a big forest bit, they've got on some, restoring some tropical peatlands, but maybe there's some that they've missed. So it is getting into the at the national level, it's getting into that. How quickly that gets down to farmers, I think, will be, again, it's related to governance and institutions, and if those barriers are big, that could just stay in the knowledge of the policymakers and never get down to the land managers. That's why we need projects like AFRICAP.
Yes.
So I guess I'm interested in trying to hear your opinion on how that interacts with food production systems in the oceans.
Yeah.
Obviously, we have different reports, and is there much cost printing happening with regards to how these effects play out in land and sea, fisheries and agriculture?
There wasn't much. There wasn't much on in the SROC, the Oceans and Climate Change, Cryosphere and Climate Change report. There wasn't much on that. We actually, in terms of the human consumption, we get only over 95% of our food comes from the land. But it makes it sound like I'm saying it's not important. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm saying that there are some areas where there's overlap. So one of those was the restoration of coastal wetlands. That seems to have a lot of co-benefits. It could potentially have negative impacts if you are taking out your mangroves to put in shrimp farms, But there are other ways of doing that where you can get, where you can raise, for example, you can raise shrimps, and you can do that within pools, within mangroves. So I'm told. I'm not a mangrove expert. So there are some interactions there where you can see some of those things working together. In terms of wild catch oceanic fish, I think there's not really been as much overlap as there maybe could be. I think the food chapter in AR6, so that's the assessment report that's currently going together. The food chapter in working group 2 will be dealing with some of those issues. So I hope it's dealt with better than it has been in the past, because it's not been dealt with very well in the past by IPCC.
We have a question, I think, from beyond the room.
Yes,
right, Helen?
we've got a few. I'll do a couple maybe. So
Yeah.
Hasna Funoon, who's joining us from Senegal, asks, could you talk about the role of the soil microbial community in increasing resilience to climate change?
Okay. Well, we know that where people have looked at soil quality and soil health.
Could you repeat the question?
Sorry, yeah. So the question was, what's the role of the soil microbial community in helping to address some of the issues? The soil microbial community is enhanced if you treat the soil well. And the headline indicators for good soil are soil organic matter. So if you can increase the soil organic matter, generally speaking, you're also improving the soil quality, the soil health, and soil quality. That's not always the case, but it's often the case. So the headline indicators, if you can do management practices that get more of the organic matter back into the soil, so you don't burn the biomass on top, you reincorporate it, you try to minimize soil disturbance. That's good for soil organic matter, and it's good for the soil microbes. And the soil microbes are, one of these indicators of soil health. So all those things go together. All those things go together through improved management of the soil. So yeah, really important.
Great. And then Sam Betts-Davis asks, is the Climate Change Commission's target for a 10% reduction in livestock in the UK by 2050 consistent with the pace of global dietary change necessary to achieve noticeable benefits of mitigation?
Yeah, so that's the committee. So that's a question about the Committee on Climate Change targets is actually a 20%, at least a 20% reduction, the Committee on Climate Change said in the report last week. People have suggested that that's not enough. I have some sympathy with that, but it is a target that the UK is going to try and do. What the UK farming industry could say is we produce livestock in this country with relatively low emissions. And if we don't produce those livestock, then we're going to have to increase the amount of imports from elsewhere. And we're going to be increasing imports from countries with maybe lower animal welfare standards and a worse emission profile. The trouble is that our agriculture, our net zero target is within our national boundaries. So if we want to hit net zero, we need to decrease emissions from our livestock sector. So a 20% will help to get us there if we also reduce food waste and we also use the spared land for sequestering carbon, restore peatlands, reforestation, all those sorts of things. So the numbers add up, even though they're quite ambitious. And 20%, I would say, is the minimum dietary change that we need in reduction of livestock product consumption. The way that it's been portrayed by the media is that it's vegans versus beef farmers. And I don't think that characterization is very useful. Firstly, because it sets people against each other. And secondly, because I think everyone can make a contribution. If you decide that you want to continue eating meat and dairy, you could just eat less of it. Smaller portion sizes, have one day where you don't eat it. And because there are more people who do eat meat and don't eat meat, that can have a bigger impact. So if you're willing to become vegan or vegetarian, that's fantastic. That's the best you can do for the climate. But if you're not willing to make that once in a lifetime decision to stop doing it, then a reduction in consumption can have a significant impact. And as responsible citizens, I think that's something we should be looking at.
More questions? Yes.
Just sort of leading on from that, have you got any sort of pearls of wisdom about national versus global targets? Because, yeah, like you say, you might be doing our bit in the UK, as it were, but this might actually have a worse effect than if we were just producing food very efficiently and exporting it. Yeah. Is that kind of tension something that you've looked at, or do you get?
Yeah. So it arises because of the way that we account for our emissions. If we did global accounting and you just looked at it, you might say the north and west of the UK Scotland included, is great for growing grass. It's got perfect bioclimatic conditions for that. It's rubbish for growing wheat and barley in those particular areas. So what we should do is we should use those areas, Ireland, New Zealand, for producing the livestock and moving them around. That's not the way that we do it. We do our accounting through national targets, which are within our national area boundaries. So that means if we've got a net zero target, then we have to reduce our emissions within that boundary. And I think there's another issue, which is perhaps even more important, is that if the UK is serious, as I believe it even still is after the last election, about maintaining a global leadership role on climate change, we can't be telling other countries who have much more significant economic and social problems than we do what to do if we're not doing something along those lines ourselves. So I think it's important in terms of our collective responsibility, if we're going to be taking a leadership role on climate change, to be doing the best we can within our national boundaries.
There's another question around there somewhere. Yes.
I might go again. When we look at things like the RCP and the various socioeconomic scenarios,
yeah,
they were always designed as reference scenarios, and they don't include any of the impacts from climate change in them. And did you see evidence in your review where you were seeing the impacts from climate change actually being taken into account? Because a lot of the projections of what a
yeah,
land might do,
yeah,
you know, you can plant a tree, but once it dies there because there's no water to fire.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
How much did you see shift maybe, and how much the impact would be encountered?
So I think that's starting to get, so because the IPCC only reviews the existing literature, we can only assess what's out there. There is more and more of that in the last 2 or 3 years. That's becoming more of an issue. So those feedback between future climate change, particularly in terms of the carbon sink. So the carbon sink is usually projected by saying, if we plant a tree, this is how many tons per hectare we'll get. And those are scaled up in different regions without worrying too much or without thinking too much about the reversibility or how we may get a different saturation position under a different future climate. But that's starting to come in, but there's not much literature out there on it. So I think
forests became net emitters of CO2 in the last 2 years.
Right.
So when you look at globally where things like the Amazon sit, the tropical forests,
yeah,
but that whole area now emits more CO2 than it absorbs.
Right.
It kind of shifts the paradigm.
It does. And that's, yeah, okay. So that's partly due to land use change as well as to climatic effects. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So those are massively important. So there's a possibility that some of these solutions, well, they need risk proofing, they need future proofing. So when we know that agroforestry, for example, or increasing the soil carbon generally is going to have good impacts, we might not get the same amount of climate mitigation that we thought we would get. But that's the beauty of having some of these things with multiple wins. Because even if you did it for a mitigation purpose or an adaptation purpose, even if it didn't deliver everything that you hoped it would at the beginning, you're still improving across a bunch of the other dimensions. So those ones that are all blue, if you do them properly, they're sort of what's sometimes called a no regrets option. Because even if they don't give you everything you need, you've accidentally made the world a better place.
Yes, Marcelo.
Yes, you just mentioned agroforestry. So, but on the livestock issue, you're going to consider potential synergies with multi-purpose land use, for example, silvopastoral, complex rotation, succession, and all that. Was that part of the analysis?
Yeah, similar to the response to the earlier one, we can only assess what's out there. So there are some of these multifunctional farming systems out there. There's more work now at the landscape level on multifunctional landscapes, where you may have a dedicated area of cropping and you've got a dedicated area of biomass for bioenergy, and you've got a dedicated area of for livestock. But then you move the resources around within those. So the livestock manure goes to this, and you use the bagasse from the cane production to fertilize the soil elsewhere or within the same land. So there is more work on that going on at the landscape scale. But I don't think that's another area where I think there could be a lot more research to try and understand those synergies, because these are options that you look at. They're sort of scale independent. But what we could have done for each one of those cells, the blue and the red ones, we could have written depends for every single one of them. That wouldn't be very helpful to policymakers. But it really is so context dependent upon where you do it and how you do it, what the previous land use was, if you're changing the land use, what the previous management was, that we need to do that. And those multifunctional landscapes, I think that's maybe the way to go. Yeah.
Got some online questions? Yeah.
You just mentioned one possible area for future research, and Talia was asking if there are others that you would recommend for postgrad students to focus on this.
Yeah, so I think that the big unanswered questions are in the barriers. So we know what to do. I think it was mentioned we've already known what to do for 10 years or more. Why aren't we doing it? So I think we need less, no, I won't say that. I'm going to say we need less natural science. But we need the same amount of natural science, but we need more social science. So the people who understand the issues associated with, if you look at the distribution of how well farmers farm in terms of emissions or anything, you've got like a little bell curve of this is the most efficient, this is the least efficient. You've got a really, really long tail of farmers who farm really badly. Moving those farmers who farm really badly just up to the median would have a big impact, because that's where all the environmental damage is being caused by those bad farmers. I don't understand why bad farmers farm badly, but I think we should try and find out. We should try and find that out, and we should try and find out why people aren't implementing the best management practices. We know in some places it's collapse of agricultural extension services, it's lack of knowledge, or those sorts of things. So helping to get those things back up and running would be a way to do it. But for research, I think that if I was doing it all again, I'm not qualified, so I couldn't do it. But in terms of the need, I think we need more social scientists trying to understand these issues about why things don't happen. We know enough about what we need to do to start doing it now. Don't sack us all tomorrow to natural scientists and physical scientists, but we do know enough to start moving forward. It's the social science aspects, I think, that we need more of.
I think what we need in the natural sciences, and is happening to some extent, is new ways of doing natural science, which we're doing in AFRICAP by bringing the modelling together with the social science and kind of mixing it up and thinking about integrated assessment systems, not just integrated assessment models, that things are all kind of model based. So it's about new ways of doing things, I think.
Great answer. I wish I'd said that.
Any more questions? Yes, Kat.
A question about soil, actually. You mentioned that, say, forests we're planting today might be vulnerable to different things like climate change over time. And do we know enough about we can manage to get more soil, more organic matter and carbon into soil, so how vulnerable or not vulnerable that is to the climate as it moves on?
Yeah, we know a bit, because there are good climate analogues around the world. You know, we've got a wide variation in temperatures and moisture content, so we know how those soils respond. It's not the same exactly as knowing what an individual soil that evolved to be high in carbon in one place, what happens to that in the future. But bioclimatic envelope modelling suggests that some peatlands that are currently peatlands under future climates will not have the same climate that allowed that peat to accumulate over all that time. So we know that some of these ecosystems in future climates could be in trouble. And in terms of the soils, just generally, not peatlands specifically, but the soil organic matter in regular soils, I think we know a bit, but we don't know what the balance, because it's a balance between the carbon inputs from the plants and the decomposition in the soil. That balance is really, really difficult to project. Most projections suggest at the moment that the increase in MPP will be larger globally, this is globally, not at individual locations, will be larger than the increase in decomposition. So that under future climate change, carbon stocks will increase. So that's what most of the global projections were. If any of you remember Peter Cox's paper back in 2000 was suggesting that we might lose tons and tons and tons of carbon from the soils. So I don't think it's been fully bottomed out. So even at the global level, we don't yet quite know what that balance is going to be. And that's where we could still use better models, I think. So we won't sack ourselves just yet. Yes.
Just wondering, with increase of focus on data in the legal answer report, just wondered the extent to which you feel we can integrate agricultural food policy with health policy.
Well, that would be sensible, wouldn't it? I'm surprised that we've not come in earlier. So colleagues in Aberdeen who've been working on this, I originally just sort of said, we know what we need to do in terms of dietary change from a climate perspective. These are friends working in public health. But nobody's interested in the climate. Nobody's going to change their diet just for the climate. It's too abstract. Surely they'll change it for their health. Jenny McDermott, who's working in Aberdeen, said, I've been working on this for 25 years, trying to get people with the worst diet in the world in Scotland to change their diet. And even though they know it's doing them damage, even though they know they might not see their grandchildren, it's still extremely difficult to do. So we should definitely integrate all of those things together. But my naive hope 10 years ago, when I went to that question with Jenny, is that if we just wrapped it up as a public health issue, we could change it immediately. And it's not that easy, unfortunately. Good question.
Going back to my obsession with simple messages, you said, I think something along the lines of insects are a red herring, by which you meant we don't need to eat insects, we can just reduce consumption. But wouldn't a simple message be, or why couldn't a simple message be to do both of those? So, consider eating insects would be appropriately cooked and take this the wrong way, and reduce meat consumption, and so there's a few sort of and things, so we can contribute in different directions.
There are and things. The reason I mention that is because people imagine, a lot of people who don't know anything about nutrition imagine that you don't get any protein from plants. And the majority of protein that's consumed on the planet is plant derived. It's not animal derived. So people think that they need meat, otherwise they won't get the protein. They don't realize that protein is available in plant materials, and they don't realize that they're probably over consuming, if they're on average, then they're over consuming protein generally by up to 80, 100%. So you can cut a lot of that without needing to fall back on the insects, the lab grown meat stuff. The BBC website loves it. They're banging on about it all the time. But actually, it makes good copy, but I don't think it's a massive part of the solution. Personally, but I agree. We don't want to throw anything out of we don't want to throw any of the tools out of the toolbox.
So this suggests a huge role for education. Do you think? Is that? I mean, one can imagine if people knew these simple facts about protein content and were sort of taught that from school age upwards, that this could considerably change things.
You would think that, wouldn't you? Beer and chips are vegan, unfortunately.
Put in a little social science thing. The knowledge gap solves very little. Most people don't make up their minds because they've been convinced by the evidence. It's because it's what Granny ate.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, new evidence, as we've noticed again and again, doesn't seem to do it. Now, if you made fake fish and chips cheaper than everything else,
yeah, that's right. So that's the carbon taxation is a big thing. There's been a lot of work done on that. How you might balance up the if you internalize the environmental damage caused by different foods, ruminant meat would become way more expensive. Chicken and pork a bit more expensive. Plant-based food cheaper. And if you did want to rebalance that, you could use the money that you raised from those taxes on those high-emitting products, and you could subsidise your fruit and your veg, which a lot of people don't get enough of. So that's one mechanism. You've got social justice and equity issues there. The poorest people eat the crappiest food, but it shouldn't be beyond the wit of humans to rebalance that somehow. It's ridiculous that you can go and buy a burger cheaper than you can go and buy fresh vegetables and fruit. That's nuts.
You got another question from beyond?
Yes, Dora, who works in Zimbabwe on promoting agroforestry technology, says that it's difficult to encourage farmers to establish agroforestry technologies. They'd rather focus on food rather than tree production.
Yeah.
Have you come across any models that have worked well to encourage that shift?
Yeah, some. So particularly where you've got productive trees. So where you've got in Africa actually, and in India, there are systems where you're putting trees in that are productive that either produce nuts or fruit, or you're just producing the leaves that are then fed to the livestock if you've got livestock in the home garden. So there are some situations like that which can work well. On a larger scale, it gets a bit more difficult, but there are organisations like the one that where the question comes from, ICRAF, those sorts of big CGIAR organisations are trying to to spread the word around this. I think it's a sleeping giant, agroforestry. It's one that we've not really considered enough.
Do we have one more question from within the room before we finish? Oh, yes, good.
Just to carry on from that agroforestry, do you think it's got potential with the tropics and maybe in the UK to expand?
I think so, particularly if we think of silver pastoral systems. So a lot of trees died or got chopped down when we converted a lot of our grasslands. If you think about the way that grassland used to be parkland and it had a few trees in it, which was good for the animals because it provided a bit of shelter in storms. It provides a bit of shade during the hot summers. So those sorts of, and it doesn't decrease the productivity of the grasslands. So silver pastoral systems, I think, could be a biggie. With whatever the government's targets are, they're probably not going to find enough areas where you can just plant up only trees. So I think dotting trees around in landscapes, improving hedgerows, putting standards within hedgerows is the way to go. So that might be a way that agroforestry could get more support, more public support than it has up until now in temperate regions.
So we better stop there. Time has flown by, I think, because we've had such excellent questions. Thank you all for your questions, and Pete for the excellent talk and also very thoughtful and intelligent responses to the questions. I really enjoyed the discussion. So let's thank Pete once again for an excellent talk.